Okay. Luna. This is Luna, not Timber. Timber is generally the troublemaker. Luna is her sister. And Luna is not as much of a troublemaker. I don't know where Timber is. I guess she's conked out somewhere. I haven't seen her yet. I haven't seen her yet today. She must be in the middle of a long morning nap. The mornings tend to be Timber's quiet time of day. Timber likes to be active at night. Excuse me. Okay. So we read the first 3 chapters of Samuel, 1 Samuel last time. And we read about the birth of Samuel and the conditions of Israel at the time of his birth. The poor spiritual conditions, the priestly family had become corrupted. And so something was going to have to be done. And God had warned, had told, had condemned the priestly family both through a man of God speaking and then through a vision to Samuel, a child, that he was going to condemn the priest, the family of the high priest Eli. So now we have the story of how that's going to take place. And in so doing, he's going to punish all of Israel for their continued waywardness. Excuse me. So, chapter 4. Now, the Israelites went out to fight against the Philistines. The Israelites camped, so the Philistines are going to be a recurring threat all throughout the books of Samuel, from Samuel's time down to the time of David. We've been seeing these guys, they were Samson's enemies, and Samson's life is probably overlapping here significantly with the beginning of 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel doesn't talk about Samson. We've already read about him in the book of Judges, but there is probably a significant chronological overlap between Samson's life and career as a judge and his battles against the Philistines with the high priesthood of Eli and the beginning of Samuel's own ministry. It's hard to say exactly to what degree these things overlap, but there's probably some overlap. So in these early chapters, especially at the beginning when Samuel was born, now later on Samuel will grow up, but there's some overlap here with these first few chapters of 1 Samuel with the Samson chapters, maybe even the Jephthah chapters too, because it could be that Jephthah was also contemporary around this time, but he was simply in the other part of the country. He was off on the other side of the Jordan fighting the Ammonites. It's hard to say. It really is. Anyway, but right now the Philistines are going to be a threat. And they are a threat. They've been a threat. They're continuing to be a threat. And we're going to be fighting them off and on for the next couple of books. Now the Israelites, excuse me. The Israelites went out to fight against the Philistines. The Israelites camped at Ebenezer and the Philistines at Aphek. The Philistines deployed their forces to meet Israel. And as the battle spread, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 of them on the battlefield. When the soldiers returned to camp, the elders of Israel asked, "Why did the Lord bring defeat upon us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the Lord's covenant from Shiloh, so that it may go with us, or that he may go with us, and save us from the hand of our enemies." Now, I don't know if the Lord has sanctioned this battle or not. We didn't read anything about them inquiring of the Lord beforehand or the Lord telling them to go fight. It just said they went to fight against the Philistines. So I have no idea if this is a divinely sanctioned battle or not. It may not be. It may very well not be. At any rate, the elders of Israel think that God caused them to be defeated, so they're going to try to seek his favor by bringing the Ark of the Covenant with them to their next fight. They were using this ark as a sort of a good luck charm. We saw this briefly kind of hinted at back in the days of the Judges. Remember those couple stories at the end of the book of Judges that didn't fit in the timeline of the rest of Judges, but were just kind of stories of other things happening at that time? Well, the second one of those, the one about the Levite concubine getting cut up into pieces, ended up involving a civil war between the tribes of Israel. And it says, let's see here, where are we exactly? In Israel, not Israel, in Judges, hang on a second. Here we go. In Judges 20, when the tribes of Israel are fighting against their brothers from the tribe of Benjamin, they're losing. They spend a couple of days losing before God gives them the victory. I said at the time, the text doesn't explain exactly why all that happened, but my guess is God was not really in favor of what was going on, so he allowed them to suffer pretty significant casualties before giving them the victory. Anyway, it said that they, after being defeated the first 2 days of the battle, they fasted until evening and presented burnt offerings and fellowship offerings and inquired of the Lord. In those days, the Ark of the Covenant of God was there, with Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, ministering before it. And they were not in Shiloh here. They had gone to a place called Mizpah. And apparently they had brought the Ark with them. They wouldn't have brought the entire tabernacle with them. But apparently they brought the Ark with them. So they already, in the days of Phinehas, and he was alive when Joshua was alive. He was the current high priest, even in the days of Joshua, at the end of Joshua's life. They, in their minds, they had already begun to see the Ark of the Covenant as a good luck charm. And here they're clearly using it as a good luck charm. And they had forgotten what the real significance of this box was. So, back to the story. So the people sent men to Shiloh, which is where the tabernacle was set up. And by this point, the tabernacle would have been a fairly stationary structure. It was originally a tent, and it was made to be assembled and disassembled and moved around and reassembled again. But after being in Shiloh, they had headquartered the tabernacle in Shiloh really since they came into the land in the days of Joshua after the conquest. And that would have been 300 plus years earlier at this point, 400 years maybe even. And so in that time, the tabernacle had developed a more or less permanent presence in Shiloh. And it was probably not just a tent any longer. It had probably been augmented and supported by, stone structures or buildings or things like that. So the tabernacle itself is not really mobile any longer. But the ark can still be carried around. So the people sent men to Shiloh, and they brought back the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord Almighty, who was enthroned between the cherubim. And Eli's 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the Ark of the Covenant of God. And again, I don't know if God wanted them to do that. I mean, clearly he didn't, because he's going to bring upon total disaster to them in a minute. But this is just something they thought they could do to curry God's favor, basically. When the Ark of the Lord's Covenant came into the camp, all Israel raised such a great shout that the ground shook. Stop that. You saw that right now. Hearing the uproar, the Philistines asked, "What's all this shouting in the Hebrew camp?" When they learned that the Ark of the Lord had come into the camp, the Philistines were afraid. "A god has come into the camp," they said. "We're in trouble. Nothing like this has happened before. Woe to us!" They hadn't actually had to fight Israel's God before. They fought Israel, but they're no big deal. It's not hard to beat Israel. Anybody can do that. What you're having a problem with is Israel's God. Who will deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods? These are the gods who struck the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues in the desert. And so that happened 300+ years earlier. And it's still factoring into the minds of these people at the time. Be strong, Philistines! Be men! Or you will be subject to the Hebrews, as they have been to you. So they don't want to be subjects. They want to be the ones making people subjects. They don't want to be subjects. They're going to have to be tough. They're going to have to be men. They're going to have to be fighters. They're going to have to defeat these people, these gods. Be men and fight! So the Philistines fought. And the Israelites were defeated. And every man fled to his tent. That means he just ran away completely. Like he's gone. He's out of the picture. The slaughter was very great. Israel lost 30,000 foot soldiers. The Ark of God was captured. And Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, died. Remember how God said that he was going to strike them both down in one day? Chapter 2, verse 34, that and what happens to your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, will be a sign to you. God is talking to Eli through the mouth of this prophet. They will both die on the same day. That happened. That same day, so back to the main story here again. That same day, so the same day as this disastrous battle, a Benjamite ran from the battle line and went to Shiloh. His clothes torn, and dust on his head. These are signs of mourning. Tearing your clothes and throwing dust on your head are signs of mourning. You can't stop that. That's right now. When he arrived, there was Eli, sitting on his chair by the side of the road. Probably the same chair he once sat in as he watched Hannah praying to herself. And didn't know what she was doing at first. So there was Eli, sitting on his chair by the side of the road, watching. Because his heart feared for the Ark of God. So he knew that what they were doing. I don't know if he approved of it or not. They may have moved the Ark out of the sanctuary without his permission. But he knew they were doing what they were doing, and he was afraid for it. He was not apparently convinced that they were going to be able to pull off their plan. When the man entered the town and told what had happened, the whole town sent up a cry. Eli heard the outcry and asked, "What is the meaning of this uproar?" The man hurried over to Eli, so he ran into town, told everybody, but didn't tell the most important guy in town, the high priest. So he went over to Eli and said, who was 98 years old, and whose eyes were set, so that he could not see. So he had lost his sight. He was now blind. Back when we saw him in chapter 1, sitting in the same chair, looking at Hannah as she was praying to herself silently, he still had eyes that could see. But I don't know how many years earlier. That would have been 10, maybe 15. I don't know how old Samuel is here at this point. But by now, his eyes are set. They're heavy, and they can no longer see. He told Eli, "I have just come from the battle line. I fled from it this very day." This guy was probably supposed to do this. He's probably not a deserter. He's probably was assigned to be the runner who carried the message of the battle to the neighboring villages. Eli asked, "What happened, my son?" The man who brought the news replied, "Israel fled before the Philistines, and the army has suffered heavy losses. Also, your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the Ark of God has been captured." When he mentioned the Ark of God, Eli fell backward off his chair by the side of the gate. So that was enough to shock him, literally shock him silly. He was so overcome by despair and grief at this news, he fell off his chair. His neck was broken, and he died, for he was an old man and heavy. He had led or judged Israel for 40 years. His daughter-in-law, the wife of Phinehas, was pregnant and near the time of delivery. When she heard the news the Ark of God had been captured, and that her father-in-law and her husband were dead, she went into labor. So this news was so great it caused her to begin her delivery prematurely, and gave birth, but she was overcome by her labor pains. As she was dying, the women attending her said, "Don't despair. You have given birth to a son." But she did not respond or pay any attention. She is so despondent. She's near death. I mean, she's dying. But she is also so despondent over the news of what's happened that she just doesn't have anything to say any longer. She named the boy Ichabod, which means no glory, as you see in your footnotes down here, saying, the glory has departed from Israel. Because of the capture of the ark of God and the deaths of her father-in-law and her husband, she said, the glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured. So they've done it. They've got God. They've got God in the box and they've captured him. What are we going to do about this now? The Philistines have done it. They've beaten God. They've done the one thing that human beings have been trying to do since the very beginning of time. They've figured out a way to beat God. So how is this situation going to be resolved, huh? They've got God locked up in a box somewhere in a temple. What are we going to do about this? You know, we don't often, this story is not talked about as much as the exile, which is to come in later books of the Bible. As time goes on down the road, about 600 years from now, they're going to go into exile. And that becomes like a more defining, but this is basically a preview of that. They're not exiled from the land here. They're not being discharged from the land. They're not being carried off as captives into foreign lands. But they are losing their Ark of the Covenant. They are losing their worship center. The text doesn't actually say this, but it's very likely that at this time or just after, we saw this messenger go back to Shiloh and spread the news. And Shiloh is not used again as a worship center for Israel. Now the text never says what happens to Shiloh. But it's very likely, very possible, that the Philistines continued their march into Israelite territory and eventually came to Shiloh and destroyed it. At any rate, whatever happened to Shiloh, it's not going to be used again as a worship site like it had been up to this point. The tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant had been there for between 300 and 400 years. One of the Jewish commentaries at the time says that gives the exact number at 369. I don't know if that's exactly accurate, but it's probably reasonable. So the tabernacle had been in Shiloh for between 300 and 400 years. The Ark of the Covenant had been there. It's not going to be there again like that. We're not going to hear Shiloh mentioned in that context again. So something happens to Shiloh just to prevent it from being used as a worship site for Israel in the future. So it's, in that sense, it is like what will happen to Jerusalem down the road where it gets destroyed and abandoned. And, so this is a very similar, but the difference is that they're not being taken captive into foreign lands. They're being conquered. The Philistines are conquering them. The Philistines are wiping out their holy sites and taking their artifacts, or at least the ark. But they're not actually exiling them to other lands. So it's a somewhat less traumatic event for that reason. But this is still a very devastating. I mean, you see all the destruction and despair that's being reached here. Because God has withdrawn his favor from Israel and the glory has departed. And so now we're going to have to figure out how to solve that problem now, aren't we? Or we're going to have to see what God does to solve that problem.